torture chambers, secret passageways, vats of acid, and deadly vaults. In 1895, Chicago police unearthed horrific evidence of torture and multiple murders at the sprawling castle of H. Holmes. Masquerading under the guise of caring doctor, kind husband, and prominent businessman, H. Holmes was a contemporary monster, designing his buildings solely for the disposal of human bodies. Torture doctor, monster of 63rd Street, H. Holmes was America's first serial killer.
Saturday evening, November 24th, 1894. A week ago today, I was placed under arrest in Boston, and after a preliminary hearing was brought here to Philadelphia, where I was confined at City Hall Police Headquarters. Yesterday, I was placed in a crowded conveyance, filled with a filthy lot of humanity, and after what seemed to me an endless drive, reached the county prison, located at 10th and Reed Streets, which is known as Moyamensing.
Our story begins in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Long before the world knew him as H. Holmes, he was Herman Webster Mudgett.
Come with me, if you will, to a tiny, quiet New England village, nestling among the picturesquely rugged hills of New Hampshire. Here, in the year 1861, I, Herman W. Mudgett, the author of these pages, was born.
The history of the Mudgett family in Gilmanton dates back to 1761, as the Mudgetts were the first white settlers in the new township. Herman spent the young years of his life growing up in this very house. His early years were ruled under strict religious studies by his mother and strong discipline delivered by his father.
Holmes was a kind of prodigy of crime, and he was really sort of an evil genius who, if it hadn't been for the fact that he was so clearly sociopathic, probably really could have been a great man.
Having great ambition and drive, Herman excelled in school. Out of anger and jealousy, his schoolmates constantly tormented him. One incident of his childhood stands out among all others.
He was dragged into the office of the town doctor and sort of forced to confront this skeleton, this mounted skeleton.
This place was one of peculiar abhorrence to me, and this becoming known to two of my older schoolmates, they one day bore me struggling and shrieking beyond its awful portals. Nor did they desist until I had been brought face to face with one of its grinning skeletons, which, with its arms outstretched, seemed ready in its turn to seize me. It was a wicked and dangerous thing to do to a child of tender years and health, but it proved a heroic method of treatment, destined ultimately to cure me of my fears, and to inculcate in me a strong feeling of curiosity, which resulted years afterwards in my adopting medicine as a profession.
The University of Michigan. The school's distinguished history includes its having the nation's first university-owned hospital. In 1871, the university's enrollment numbers were 1,100, one of the largest in the United States. After spending 1 year at the College of Vermont, Herman Mudgett enrolls in the University of Michigan Medical School on September 21st, 1882. It is here that Herman perfects two of his natural talents, chemistry and anatomy.
As a profiler, you analyze behavior. That's what you do. You analyze behavior. Had H.H. Holmes been alive now, somebody would have called Tom Cronin. Most serial killers don't finish college. They're smart enough to. Oh, yeah, they could. They don't finish because they usually don't have the self-discipline. It's that point of their life that they've conned enough people. They go to grammar school and high school because they're learning their trade, which their trade is an ultimate con man. Holmes is really someone unique because he finishes. Not only finishes, he finishes medical school. We can look at it saying, well, in medical school back then in Michigan, probably some of his fantasy was working on the cadavers. And wow, the University of Michigan gave him cadavers to work on. Well, that helps his fantasy. What really was unique about Holmes was the fact that he actually finished school. He went all the way through college. Most serial killers don't do that.
Herman's lust for blood is developed in medical school, becoming immune to death and dismemberment by receiving pleasure from operating on human cadavers. He also practices the criminal art of scamming by insuring people and substituting an unidentifiable cadaver in place of their corpse. Herman Webster Mudgett graduates from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1884. In the 2 years that follow, Herman further perfects his conning skills in numerous states across the Midwest, serving as drugstore clerk, asylum attendant, teacher, and doctor. The life skills Herman had learned now made him ready for a life devoted to crime. To elude former acquaintances coming forth with accusations of fraud, poisoning, or death, Herman decided to change his identity. The world would never again hear from Herman Webster Mudgett. He would now be known as Henry Howard Holmes, H.H. Holmes. Chicago, 1886. The city of Chicago was vigorously rebuilding after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, making it a booming financial city, excellent for real estate development and job seekers from around the world. This was the Gilded Age of America, where tycoons and self-made millionaires were held in high esteem. It was also the perfect atmosphere for Holmes to capitalize in. As others received inspiration from Rockefeller and Carnegie, H.H. Holmes drew his dark desires from the torture chambers of Edgar Allan Poe. Just south of Chicago, the suburb of Englewood was thriving with commerce. The train station itself had 9 leading lines of railway and over 100 trains stopping there every day. No other suburb of Chicago had this luxury.
Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a pleasure to meet you.
Arriving in Chicago, Holmes finds work immediately at the E.S. Holton drugstore, located at the southeast corner of 63rd and Wallace in Englewood. Several months later, Everett Holton dies of supposed natural causes. Then Claire Holton, his wife, disappears after selling the drugstore to Holmes. Owning the drugstore, Holmes had a steady flow of cash. He would often purchase and resell goods and properties under his numerous aliases. In addition to scamming creditors, Holmes obtained his funds from other phony inventions, such as a mineral water elixir, which in reality was obtained from the city's water supply. 1888, Holmes secures a lease on the vacant property across the street from the drugstore, the southwest corner of 63rd and Wallace. It is here that Holmes will make his horrific dreams come true. He will construct a building for which the entire world will remember him.
Fantasies start very young, and so what he did then was he took a step furtherance of his fantasies to make it reality. And probably, if we had done a little bit of investigation back then, we would have seen things like his plans, but not just plans for a building, because we'd expect to see architectural plans, but plans for his torture rooms.
As Holmes finalized the blueprints of his building in August of 1888, a bloodthirsty butcher named Jack the Ripper was prowling the streets of London, murdering and mutilating prostitutes. As news of the overseas terror hits American newspapers, Americans are horrified. Yet they are relieved that no such vile monster exists in America.
All the way over here in Chicago, Holmes is going, you think that's good? Wait.
For the suburb of Englewood, the building Holmes is erecting at 63rd and Wallace is a massive construction project. Day after day, passers-by stop to gaze at the spectacle of the many laborers working together to create a magnificent new edifice in their neighborhood. Englewood residents were so impressed with the massive building that they named it the Castle. From its outward appearance, it seemed rather normal. But like the duality of Holmes, the exterior and interior of the building were extremely different.
Holmes himself was the architect of the building. He was the only one who knew its design. There was this constant turnover of workers on the building. He would hire a mason to put in a wall and then fire the guy, or hire somebody to put in part of a staircase and then fire him. And there seemed to be several very sinister reasons behind that. One was he managed not to pay a lot of these people because he was always claiming that they were doing incompetent work. But the other, much more insidious reason was that no one except him really had a clear idea of what the structure of the interior of the house was. He had a huge bank vault installed in one of the rooms. And the way he did it was he put the vault in first while the building was under construction, and then built the room around it. And he bought this thing on credit and then refused to pay for it. The bank company said they were going to repossess the vault. Holmes said, well, come on in and do, but if you damage my building in any way, I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth.
The bottom floor of the castle housed a pharmacy, jewelry store, barber shop, restaurant, and a blacksmith shop. Behind this innocent facade was a Gothic house of horrors designed by the mind of a monster. The third floor seemed innocent enough, containing rented rooms, legitimate offices, and Holmes's own bedroom. But it was the second floor that contained 35 rooms, many specifically designed as killing chambers. Disorienting unsuspecting victims, the labyrinthian construction contained numerous staircases and doorways that led nowhere. For a quick method of hiding a victim's body, a concealed greased chute and trapdoor led directly into the basement of the castle. The basement held the most terrifying rooms, resembling a medieval torture dungeon. Acid vats, quicklime pits, and a crematorium disguised as a glass-bending furnace were Holmes's favorite methods of immediate body disposal.
There was something that Holmes claimed was what he called an elasticity determinator, which was supposedly a device to create, as he put it, a race of giants by strapping people onto this thing and then stretching them out. But it was clearly some kind of torture device.
After cleaning and mounting their bones, Holmes would profit from his victims by selling their skeletons to local medical schools and universities. Holmes would make a killing in Chicago, financially and literally. Benjamin Freelon Peitzel arrives in Chicago with his family around the fall of 1889. Sadly, Benjamin Peitzel seemed to be born with a black cloud over his head, failing at every job he attempted. He had been traveling around the Midwest for the last 10 years, working miscellaneous labor jobs and also being arrested on several occasions for crimes ranging from petty larceny to forgery. Peitzel continued to search for work in Chicago to support his wife Carrie and their 5 children. Desi Peitzel was the oldest at 17. Then there were Alice, Nellie, Howard, and their infant son Wharton. The hardships of providing for a large family and continually seeking new employment took a toll on Peitzel, and he began to drink heavily. Although he transformed from an attractive young man to a worn, beat-up shadow of his former self, Benjamin Peitzel was totally devoted to his family, working any job he could find to provide for them. Peitzel answers a newspaper ad seeking carpenters for a new building in Englewood. There he meets Dr. H. Holmes, and their lives become fatefully interwoven.
One of Peitzel's big problems was that he was an alcoholic, but he was a big strapping guy. And anyway, he became Holmes's right-hand man. They became very, very close. He and Holmes became very much partners in crime. And Peitzel served a number of important purposes for Holmes. Holmes himself, though obviously a very, very dangerous person, didn't look particularly dangerous. He was a rather slight, elegant man, one of the reasons he was so attractive to women.
I grew to like his quiet ways, and to depend on him to take charge of the work at times when I was obliged to be absent.
Having a very close association with Benjamin, Holmes is intimately involved with the Peitzel family, becoming like another member of the family.
My first intimate acquaintance with Mrs. Peitzel and her children began in the fall of 1893, although I had often seen them prior to that, especially the children, whom I liked and looked upon as remarkably bright when they had come to me from time to time upon errands.
May 1st, 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition is open to the public in Chicago. Spanning 600 acres, sprawled out along beautiful Lake Michigan, the magnificent fair is a monumental sight to behold. Over 20 million people from around the world would attend the dazzling World's Fair between May 1st and October 30th, 1893. Holmes utilizes the World's Fair as the perfect opportunity to capitalize on his demented design of the castle. Located only a few miles from the World's Fair, Holmes's castle was perfect lodging for tourists. Holmes decides to rent rooms to visitors of the fair. He entirely renovates the upper floors of the castle, bringing in the most modern furnishings and luxuries, all purchased on credit, which Holmes had no intention of repaying. In addition to placing newspaper ads for rooms to rent, Holmes visited the fair with several of the Peitzel children, preying on elderly women who flaunted their wealth, making sure he invited them back to the castle for a warm night's stay in a soft bed.
They're not calling their relatives, telling them where they're at. They just know that they're going to Chicago to see the Columbian Exposition. Perfect victims, because they're unknown in the city. Their relatives, wherever they came from, know that they were coming to Chicago, and they never came back. Now, how do you start to find them? They don't even know where they stayed. Perfect, easy victims. I'm sure some of them got in and out of his place with no problem. And others, they walked in and they never checked out.
Some of the rooms had been completely lined with asbestos to make them soundproof.
Hidden in Holmes's office was a master control panel which connected to gas lines leading into airtight sleeping chambers. Holmes would lead his victims into the rooms, lock them in, and turn on the gas, asphyxiating them while watching their demise.
Let me out! Holmes, let me out, please! Holmes! Holmes! Holmes, please! Holmes!
At the height of the World's Fair, Holmes masterfully juggles his castle businesses, renting rooms, dodging creditors, selling skeletons, and attending to the needs of the many women in his life.
I have had many young ladies in my employ, most of whom are still living in and about Chicago, whose parents and friends know only too well that far from being their seducer, I have done much to materially help them in their narrow lives.
Being a personable, attractive young doctor and businessman, Holmes won the hearts of many women throughout his life. At one point, Holmes managed to secretly have 3 wives, each never knowing of the others. In 1890, Julia Connor became Holmes's employee and mistress, living at the castle with her daughter Pearl. When she became pregnant and demanded marriage, Holmes agreed on the condition that she allowed him to perform an abortion on her. She agreed. Neither Julia nor her daughter Pearl were ever seen again. Just a week later, Holmes sold a clean, articulated skeleton to the Hahnemann Medical College for nearly $200. In 1892, Holmes acquired another mistress, Emmeline Sigrand, and employed her as private secretary. Holmes sent Emmeline into the vault to retrieve some papers and sealed it, suffocating her to death. Several weeks later, the University of Chicago acquired a female skeleton from Dr. Holmes. In 1893, Minnie Williams became Holmes's new private secretary and eventually his mistress. Minnie was the beneficiary of a property in Fort Worth, Texas, valued at over $40,000. Holmes murdered Minnie and her younger sister Nanny after having Minnie sign over the Fort Worth property to him. In 1894, Georgiana Yoke became Holmes's third wife. He married her under the name Henry Mansfield Howard. Like his other legitimate wives, Georgiana lived out her entire life. Peitzel's drinking worsened and became more of a problem as time progressed. Late at night, workers in the castle would hear Holmes and Peitzel arguing over money matters. Holmes knew that Peitzel was familiar with his dirty dealings at the castle and feared that Peitzel might spread the word while in a drunken stupor. Peitzel had outlived his usefulness, so Holmes devises a plan.
He persuaded Peitzel to take out a very large insurance policy on his life. Peitzel's wife, Carrie, was the beneficiary of this policy. And the plan was that they were going to stage Peitzel's death in Philadelphia, which was where the insurance company was located. And Holmes was going to substitute a cadaver that he assured Peitzel he would have no trouble getting hold of. Peitzel was going to go underground for a while, and they would collect this money and then split the proceeds.
It's like going to the amusement park. The first time you get on a roller coaster, it's scary. You're close to falling out, and that people like that thrill, get to that line. Well, association with a guy like Holmes would be the same thing. People get close. They don't think they're ever going to be the victim.
Around the end of November 1893, Holmes and Peitzel leave Chicago. For months, Holmes and Peitzel are on the run and continue to commit frauds across the country.
Harry Gordon. A pleasure to meet you. Alexander E. Cook. A.C. Hayes. Franklin. Herbert Pratt. Edward Henderson. Henry Mansfield Holmes. George Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The pleasure is mine, my dear.
July 1894. Holmes attempts to swindle yet another drugstore owner in St. Louis. This time, it doesn't work. For the first time in his criminal career, Holmes is locked behind bars.
I had never been arrested, and I had the same horror of it that I would of being shot.
Marion Hedgepeth, who was a very notorious outlaw at the time, shared a jail cell with Holmes. And while Holmes was in jail with Hedgepeth, Holmes told him of this plan, this insurance plan that he had cooked up. Why Holmes reveal this to Hedgepath is a little bit of a mystery.
Hedgepath gives Holmes the name of a crooked attorney in order for Holmes to collect on Peitzel's fraudulent insurance plan. Holmes promises to send Hedgepath $500 for his referral after the insurance money is collected. Before being released from prison, Holmes reflects on the execution of a fellow inmate.
Next morning, upon looking from my latticed window across the courtyard, I saw him meet his death upon the gallows in the presence of a large and morbidly curious crowd of people. If I had been in need of any warning to deter me from almost immediately placing myself in a similar position, I know of no stronger one that I could have received than to witness this man's death struggles. To see the crowd make light of it almost before he was dead, quarreling to possess small portions of a rope which sent his soul hence, and I think of his clothes. Gruesome relics they were, indeed.
Holmes was bailed out of prison by his bewildered new bride, Georgiana Yoke, after Holmes spun lies about the reasons behind his incarceration. Several weeks later, Holmes and Peitzel arrive in Philadelphia. They settle on 1316 Callowhill Street as the location for their insurance scam. Peitzel tells his wife Carrie all the details of the scam. She begs him not to go through with it, but after some convincing, she agrees. Peitzel sets up as B.F. Perry, a patent dealer. 1 month later, an inventor walks into the office of 1316 Callowhill Street to further discuss his patent idea with Perry. Finding the office empty, the inventor walks upstairs, where he discovers the body of B.F. Perry lying dead on the floor.
Holmes went ahead and actually killed Peitzel. Exactly how remains somewhat unclear, but he apparently killed him with chloroform, possibly got him drunk, then somehow chloroformed him to death, and then faked a kind of explosion that had supposedly taken place in the house among these various chemicals that were there, and he burnt Peitzel's face and disfigured him somewhat.
I had not yet wholly recovered from the effects of the chloroform and was dazed. This was not due to having come suddenly upon a dead body, for my medical experience of years before had rendered me accustomed to disagreeable sights and scenes. But the man had been far more than an ordinary employee, one whom, although most of our tastes were dissimilar, I had always liked, and had fewer disagreements with than would likely have been the case had he been my brother.
Forensics was in a very rudimentary stage. The most that you could do with a blood stain was go and identify that in fact it was blood. When Benjamin Peitzel's body was found and they identified chloroform in the stomach contents, they were just very lucky that they had a large quantity so that they could go with the physical characteristics, the color and the odor of chloroform. Because if there had only been trace amounts, there wasn't a test that could have been done to positively identify minute amounts of chloroform until well into the 1940s, when there were instrumental techniques available to identify various organic compounds.
The body of Benjamin Peitzel would need to be legally identified, not only by Holmes, but also by a direct relative of the Peitzel family. Carrie and her 3 youngest children, 13-year-old Nellie, 11-year-old Howard, and 18-month-old infant Wharton, were all very ill. Dessie, the oldest at 17, would have to stay and help care for her younger siblings. Carrie is desperate. She has no money for medicine or food, and no one to take care of her children. She sends her second eldest child, 15-year-old Alice, with Holmes to identify the body. Carrie still believes that her husband is alive, safe, and in hiding.
Unfortunately, if 100 years ago there was soft tissue and even portions of the skin associated with the fingertip perhaps, there wouldn't have been the immediate looking at the fingerprints to identify the person, because during that time period at the late 19th century, the identification technique that was used to individualize people was the Bertillon method, which basically looked at a series of body measurements: the arm span of a person, the width of their head, the length of their left foot, these type of examinations. And they wouldn't have looked for the friction ridge impressions that would have positively identified the person, because fingerprint technology wasn't the identification method of choice until around 1903 and after.
Alice and Holmes positively identify the body, and Holmes arranges Alice in a hotel in Indianapolis. The coroner's office rules it an accidental death. Upon Holmes's return, Carrie is shocked when he arrives without Alice. He convinces her that Alice and Benjamin are safe, and that it is best to take Nellie and Howard to stay with their father. With detectives investigating the insurance case, she would be easily spotted traveling with 5 children.
The insurance company investigated this and concluded that, in fact, this was an actual legitimate accident, and they paid the money to Peitzel's wife, but Holmes managed to finagle most of it from her. Meanwhile, she was going to travel with the other 2 children at some later date to rendezvous with them.
Serial killers like to identify women who are kind of needy, women who will be convinced to do just about anything. They actually con women into getting into a very vulnerable position. Humans are funny. We're the only animal that never listens to the inside. The inside telling you, don't do this, this is wrong.
Throughout the many states Holmes travels with the Peitzel children, Alice finds time to write letters to her mother, updating her on their latest journey.
Friday, September 21st, 1894, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dear Mama and Babe, I have to write all the time to pass away the time. Have you gotten 4 letters from me besides this? I wish that I could hear from you, but I don't know whether I would get it or not.
Like a master game player, Holmes uses Carrie Peitzel and her 3 children as pawns, at one point lodging them only several blocks away from each other. Never once did he think about a mother's love for her missing children. It truly seems that Holmes is enjoying himself.
October 6, 1894, Indianapolis, Indiana. Dear Mama, why don't you write to me? I have not got a letter from you since I have been away, and it will be 3 weeks day after tomorrow. Friday, October 14, 1894, Detroit, Michigan. I wish I could see you all. I'm getting so homesick that I don't know what to do. Howard is not with us now. I will have to close and write more tomorrow, so goodbye, love to all, with kisses to all. Your loving daughter, E. Alice Peitzel.
As Holmes acts out his fiendish plot, he makes one small mistake. He never sends the criminal Hedgepath $500 that he promised while in prison.
When Hedgepath, in prison, read of the murder of Peitzel, he immediately contacted the warden of the prisons, and the insurance company set the Pinkertons on Holmes's trail at that point.
The distinguished Pinkerton Detective Agency became known for their ability to chase down a criminal from one end of America to the other. Some of their accomplishments include thwarting an early assassination plot on the life of President Abraham Lincoln and destroying a highly active spy ring of the Confederacy. The Pinkertons were also the innovators of the mugshot, collecting a photographic database of contemporary criminals. Their motto of "We never sleep" would be put to the test in their search for Holmes, traveling back and forth throughout the Midwest. Holmes is found and arrested by the Pinkertons on November 17, 1894, in Boston. He is transported to Moyer-Mincing Prison in Philadelphia and tried for conspiracy to cheat and defraud the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company. Holmes pleads guilty to the fraud charge and insists that Peitzel committed suicide.
Here's Holmes, suspected of Peitzel's murder and of having scammed the insurance company of a lot of money. Here was Carrie with her 2 remaining children. The question was, where were these other 3 children that Holmes had possession of and that had disappeared? And Holmes kept making up one story after another. You know, first he said they were with the father, and then they were with some other accomplice.
It's just a manipulation. You know why? Because they came to see him every day and talk more. Otherwise, I'd be all by myself in my cell. I don't want to do that. I want to be surrounded by people. Con men don't like being in jail because there's nobody in jail but other con men, and they don't want to be conned. And they're enjoying it. It takes a long time before people realize, wait a minute, he's bullshitting us. Well, yeah, but you gave him 2 weeks worth of interviews. Well, that was great. He loved it. Otherwise, you've been in his cell for 2 weeks. Nobody would have talked to him.
The suspicion was growing that he had killed these children, even though as almost impossible as that was to believe. So a detective named Frank Geyer, who is really in many ways the hero of the story, was assigned to try to follow Holmes's, again, very torturous odyssey that he'd made and see if he could locate the children.
Detective Geyer follows the locations Alice wrote on her letters. Letters that Holmes never sent to her mother. On June 26, 1895, full of hope and courage, Detective Geyer started on his journey.
In the end, after several months of traveling all over, following in Holmes's footsteps, Frank Geyer did in fact manage, by dint of incredibly hard and heroic kind of detective work, to locate the bodies of all 3 children. A little boy he found charred remains of the little boy in a stove in a little house in Indianapolis. And they dug up the remains of the 2 little girls up in Toronto. Once that was discovered, the extent of Holmes's fiendishness, his monstrosity, became evident to the public. Holmes was instantly, really overnight, became this nationally infamous, nationally notorious figure, you know, the greatest criminal of his age.
On July 19, 1895, Chicago police enter the Holmes castle. The world would now learn of the horrors that the castle had kept secret for so very long. As disoriented detectives and police searched the upper floors of the castle, the true depths of Holmes's evil were waiting in the basement. Among the death devices in the basement of the castle, investigators find piles of mixed human and animal bones, bloody women's undergarments, and a wooden dissection table saturated with dried blood. Chicago police were inundated with names of people reported missing from the World's Fair. 50 missing people were eventually traced to the Castle of Horrors. The evidence, blood and bones found in the basement posed a problem for 19th century criminal investigative techniques.
It was very difficult to go and identify even the bones as being human in origin, because with the very small fragments you didn't have enough of the identifying characteristics to be able to make that ID.
The world is now calling Holmes the monster of 63rd Street, torture doctor, and the modern Bluebeard. Overnight, Holmes transforms from arch swindler to arch fiend. A Chicago journalist calls Holmes a multi-murderer.
The Holmes case generated this incredible amount of national attention and really international attention. Really in his own time and in America, Holmes was much more notorious and more widely known than Jack the Ripper, who was a contemporary of his. Then as now, people were very, very fascinated to sort of visit the sites of these terrible crimes. And his castle became a kind of tourist site. And there were various people who wanted to take it over and turn it into a kind of murder museum. And then just before some impresario was about to make it again into this tourist attraction, it burnt down. Somebody burnt it down. I mean, it could have been, who knows, some outraged citizen who didn't want this to become some very morbid tourist attraction.
While Holmes languishes in prison, he writes an autobiography titled Holmes's Own Story.
My sole object in this publication is to vindicate my name from the horrible aspersions cast upon it, and to appeal to a fair-minded American public for a suspension of judgment, and for that free and fair trial which is the birthright of every American citizen, and the pride and bulwark of our American Constitution.
He's supposedly going to be confessing, but he starts out creating a picture in the countryside. It's not a confession. He knows that he's going to be writing this thing, and people are going to be reading it, maybe 100 years from now or more. We all want to be remembered. These guys make sure they are.
Holmes was desperately trying to convince the public that he was innocent. He was in a hurry for a good reason. On September 23, 1895, his trial date was set. Holmes would now have to answer for his many heinous crimes. The trial of the century commences at Philadelphia City Hall on October 28, 1895. The trial of H.H. Holmes is filled with manipulation and theatrics, which were conceived and portrayed by none other than Holmes himself. On the first day of trial, the courtroom is stunned as Holmes dismisses his counsel.
May it please the court, I have no inclination to ask the present counsel to continue in the case, where I can see it will be against their own interests. Bearing this fact in mind, I have within the last few moments discharged them from the case.
Holmes, the multi-murderer, is now Holmes, the attorney.
Holmes is now in charge. He's center stage. He doesn't just want to be on trial. He wants to be the ringmaster, to get everything. And he can stand up and he can walk over towards the jury box.
When was your first visit to the Callow Hill Street House? Could it have been possible for Peitzel to drink this liquid, then pass out from the effects? What was the approximate size of this lancet? Was your first examination of Peitzel determined an accidental death?
Throughout the trial, the witnesses explained by expert testimony that it was impossible for Peitzel to have killed himself based on the crime scene and autopsy evidence. Holmes knows he is failing.
Let the lawyers back in. Why does he let the lawyers back in? I won it. They lost it. He has somebody to blame. They never want to take the blame. They never have to take the blame. It's always somebody else's fault. And when it's over, when I'm found guilty, I can say, well, I did the best I could.
On the third day of the trial, a woman dressed in black is led into the courtroom. It is Carrie Peitzel, a young woman of 37. She seems to have aged decades since the death of her husband and 3 children. In the hour she is on the stand, Carrie tearfully recounts the insurance fraud, and Holmes is taking her children across the country, never hearing from them again. The district attorney holds Alice's letters that Holmes never delivered.
Oh my God, Mr. Graham, that's my daughter Alice.
All at once, everyone in the courtroom is crying. The judge dabs his eyes with a handkerchief. Jury members and police officers weep. The testimony affects every person in the courtroom except one, H.H. Holmes, who shows only indifference as he doodles on a pad.
By the time these people start exhibiting aberrant behavior, it's too late to give them a conscience. You can't give them a conscience. They've already evolved. They're gone. We've lost them.
As days go by, crowds of the curious grow larger and larger, all fighting to catch a glimpse of the mysterious torture doctor. Being Holmes's most current wife, Georgiana Yoke tells all she truly knows about her secretive husband. The court is shocked by what happens next. Holmes, who had shown no remorse towards Carrie Peitzel's testimony of her dead children lying in the morgue, sobs uncontrollably at the sight of his wife.
He was a great manipulator. He does it in court. When the whole place is crying, he probably thought, oh, I missed my cue. I should have cried there. So later on, when his ex-wife comes in, he's got to show that I'm not a monster. I can cry like everybody else. And so I got to do a couple of these things for the jury, because I got to show them that I'm a real human being, because otherwise they're going to see me as having one eye, green teeth, and a hump on my back. When I don't want them to think that, I want them to think I'm a real guy. But it's a great acting job.
The defense closes its case based on final argument alone. There would be no statement from Holmes. The crowd, who had waited so long to hear from Holmes personally, reacts appropriately disappointed.
Holmes's trial was kind of the O.J. Simpson trial of the day. It just generated this huge amount of publicity. The case had become a kind of national obsession. Of course, there wasn't CNN or Court TV back then, so it couldn't be covered quite as relentlessly, but it was covered very, very extensively. There were true crime books and pamphlets and all kinds of stuff. And Holmes himself had become a sort of folk figure almost, you know, the sort of national boogeyman.
courtroom fills for the final verdict to be read. Holmes becomes extremely nervous when not one of the jury members looks at him. In his entire criminal career, this is the moment Holmes never believed would occur. He is found guilty of murder in the first degree. Herman Webster Mudgett, alias H.H. Holmes, would be hanged on May 7th, 1896.
While Holmes was in jail, awaiting the execution of the sentence, he was made an offer by William Randolph Hearst, supposedly for a significant amount of money, to provide his confessions. Holmes, who had already issued about a half a dozen completely self-contradictory versions of his crimes, clearly at this point felt he had nothing to lose. He was going to die anyway. In this confession, he did a complete about-face and portrayed himself as the worst monster who ever lived. He just basically confessed to every crime anybody had ever suspected him of and threw in a few more for good measure.
He's reliving the fantasies after the fact now. He's reliving the fantasies of things that he did.
She was very willing to do this and prepared to leave the vault upon completing the letter, only to learn that the door would never again be opened until she had ceased to suffer the tortures of a slow and lingering death. The partial excavation in the walls of this room found by the police was caused by Latimer's endeavoring to escape by tearing away the solid brick and mortar with his unaided fingers. I closed the door and turned on both the oil and steam to their full extent. In a short time, not even the bones of my victim remained. It was the footprint of Nanny Williams that was found upon the painted surface of the vault door, made during her violent struggles before death. Only one difficulty presented itself. It was necessary for me to kill him in such a manner that no struggle or movement of his body should occur. I overcame this difficulty by first binding him hand and foot, and having done this, I proceeded to burn him alive by saturating his clothing and his face with benzene and igniting it with a match. As soon as he had ceased to breathe, I cut his body into pieces, and by the combined use of gas and corn cobs, proceeded to burn it with as little feeling as though it had been some inanimate object. I immediately took them to the Vincent Street house and compelled them to get within the large trunk, through the cover of which I had made a small opening and ended their lives by connecting the gas with the trunk. Then came the opening of the trunk and the viewing of their little blackened and distorted faces. Then the digging of their shallow graves in the basement of the house. The ruthless stripping off of their clothing and the burial without a particle of covering save the cold earth. I am convinced that since my imprisonment, I have changed woefully and gruesomely from what I was formerly in feature and figure. My features are assuming a pronounced satanical cast. My head and face are gradually assuming an elongated shape. I believe fully that I am growing to resemble the devil.
on the gallows. Just before he died, he recanted. He claimed that the confession that he had published was a complete fabrication.
The extent of my wrongdoing in the taking of human life consists in contriving the killing of 2 women that have died at my hands as a result of criminal operations. That is all I have to say.
H.H. Holmes is hanged on Thursday, May 7th, 1896, just 9 days before his 35th birthday. At 10:25 a.m., he is pronounced dead.
He was very concerned that after his execution, his body would be dug up either by medical men seeking to dissect his brain and find out what made him tick, or just ghoulish sort of, souvenir hunters. And he requested that he be buried within a big slab of concrete, which he actually was. One of the things about Holmes is that nobody knows for sure how many people he actually killed. Although in my researches, which were pretty, I feel, thorough and extensive, it seemed very clear to me that he murdered at least 9 people. There have been stories that he killed 50, 100, countless people, particularly in Chicago at the height of the World's Fair.
How many people did Holmes actually murder? Most likely, no one will ever know. Holmes and the many other people that came in contact with him are long gone, having taken the answers with them to their graves.
I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world. And he has been with me since.